Hello, welcome to this video tutorial on creating 3D site analysis diagrams in Rhino and Illustrator. This will follow on from the previous videos looking at downloading OS data from Digimaps and importing it and formatting it in Rhino. We then looked at creating plan diagrams and also small sectional diagrams and adding extra layers of information to these in Illustrator. So we're going to be following the same principles to those previous videos, so I recommend you go back and watch those if you haven't already, as we'll be going quite quickly through this, as we'll be using a lot of the similar techniques we covered in those previous videos. Now I'm going to be setting up a 3D view which we'll be using for our diagrams to overlay onto. Now to do this I've got my 3D height data imported here and my 2D CAD data as well. And I'm going to set up a kind of viewpoint which I quite like, which will allow me to add on different areas of diagrammatic elements onto my image in order to explain my site and the possible sort of surroundings of the area. Now, usually to do this, I'll set up what's called a parallel projection in Rhino, which will be a kind of more orthographic or diagrammatic viewpoint to allow me to kind of create my 3D image. By default, Rhino uses a perspective projection, which means it kind of acts as if a real camera would, which has a focal length and a vanishing point on it, and that can be seen just on this right hand side with nothing selected. In your properties panel, you'll have projection as perspective and it will have a lens length. And if you change this lens length, it will change the kind of focal point of the image and how sort of wide the lens is on that. For this particular example, we're not going to be using a perspective projection, we're going to be using what's called a parallel projection. And if I switch this just by selecting this option here and changing to parallel, you can see that it's much more sort of diagrammatic, orthographic, and all the vertical lines are parallel to one another. And these are a lot more useful when you're doing kind of more diagrammatic or drawings which need to retain scale of objects and don't want to be sort of distorted by a focal length. So what I'm going to do is, now that's switched to parallel, we're going to find a good view, and my site's sort of in the middle of these buildings, so we want something where we can kind of see the site in the middle there. And once you're happy with your selected view, we'll go to View, Set View, and we're going to save it using the Named Views tab. Now this is really important that you do this, because when we start to overlay shadow layers or extra bits of information onto our diagrams at a later stage, it's really important that you can go back to your view and make sure that you can line up all the information on top of each other. So this is a really crucial stage. So just make sure when you get your view you save it out as well. And we'll just save it as diagram 3D there. What this means is once you've saved it, you can go off, find a new view in your model, and you can double click back on the diagram to go back to your original view. Now with that saved, we're just going to select all my lines in this viewport, and we're going to do a make 2D just by typing in make 2D to create a 3D drawing from these objects. Okay. Once that's made, we go back to our top view, can move that out, and you can see there we've now got our 3D view saved out. You might have areas like this where you've got slight bits of lines showing below your objects. This doesn't matter too much because we can tidy this up in Illustrator later as well. So once you've got that, we're going to just put this on a sheet just by going to this site plan one I've got set up here, and we'll just centre that onto a layout sheet there. This will allow us to easily export it out into Illustrator. So once you've saved it and you're happy with that, we can right click on our site plan, go to print, and we're just going to print it out as a Rhino PDF, just like we've done with the previous videos. And I'm going to save that here as Site 3D. What we'll do now is I'm going to open up Illustrator, and we're going to open up a new file. And I've just dropped my Site 3D image onto there to open that up in Illustrator. Close these ones down, like so. And you'll see as we bring it in, we've already got a slight issue with the line weights, which is fine. So we'll start by tidying that up first. And to do that, I'm just going to select my image we brought in. We want to unclip the group just using the Edit Contents button here, and then if we cut the objects out and just paste them back in place like so, we can then edit these particular lines. I'm going to select the yellow lines first. If we select similar objects, just like we've done previously, and I'm going to go through this quite quickly because we covered it in the previous video on setting up plan diagrams, so please go back and watch that if you haven't already. And I'm just going to add these each to their own layer. So we'll do one with buildings, we'll do another with the outlines here, and we'll do a third. We'll just take these extra lines and we'll add those into the outlines as well, just by pasting those in place to copy them from one board into another board. Now we can have a go at tidying up these line weights. So we're going to take the outlines line weight and we'll knock this down. I'm going to actually use the colour picker or the eyedropper tool here just to copy this line style so that matches up like so. And then for the buildings, we're going to make the line weights a bit heavier so we can see them more clearly. So instead of 12, we'll make them 0.5 there, so they're more visible. And that's our base layer of our image. Now we can crop off some of these extra lines just by making this view a bit smaller, and I'm just going to crop this in so it's a bit tighter, like so. And I'm actually, for my outlines, let's make this a slightly darker line because it's a grey at the moment. Let's make this black and a 2.5. There we go, so you can see it's quite subtle, but there is a difference between those two. And this bottom one we can make the thinnest. Let's make it a 0.15. So we've got a good hierarchy of lines, there you go. So you can see that the outlines are slightly darker than the rest of the street there. Now you might also want to go around and just tidy up any extra lines you have here, so I'm just going to delete these ones from behind this building, making sure my building layer is locked, so I'm not deleting any of the building but just the lines that sit behind it. You might have the same kind of happening here. I'm not going to tidy up this too much, but for your own diagrams it's worth spending some time just going through and tidying up any discrepancies. If you've downloaded this information from Digimaps like I have, you often get slight inconsistencies in the 3D model just because it's downloaded from another source, so you might have holes in the model like this or extra lines that you might not need. So it's good just to take the time to tidy those up if needs be. But that should be fine for now. So here we have our base image with our 3D model and our site on top. Now what we can do now is start to add on some overlays and some diagrammatic elements onto this to start building it up. But before that we need to sort of understand what kind of diagrams we want to make with this model. The first thing I can do, like we did with our previous options, is add on our site boundary. You might have already done this in Rhino, in which case it's quite easy to just have that and adjust the line weight in here. Mine wasn't modelled in Rhino, so I'm just going to draw it on using the pen tool again. And let's just kind of use some of these lines as reference for where my site might sit. And let's say it's kind of in between these buildings here, sort of nestled in amongst them, like so. It might be that your site outline is slightly hidden by some buildings, in which case, so for this, let's do it in a way that we can kind of show that our site line actually goes behind buildings. So let's say here, for instance, it will actually follow along this line, and here as well. And what I might do there is you could use the scissors tool to cut your line you previously drew out, so we don't have the sight line there, and then where it goes behind a building, let's say we make it a dashed line, so it's clear that it's there but it's being currently obscured by the building. You should just be able to snap that on the end like so. And maybe it's the same thing is happening down here. So it's being obscured by this building too. And here as well. So you're just using the scissors tool to just cut these lines short. Like so. So we've quite clearly got our outline, but you can see it's being cut short and it's hidden below the two buildings there, which we're using the dotted line to show. So that could be a good base. So we started with just drawing on our site outline, and now we want to start to show some different elements of the site, or potentially some sunlight studies. We could show kind of traffic or land use types as well, much like we've done in plan. If you want to overlay shadows on this, I'll kind of go through that process as we did with the plan. Very simple. We can go back to our Rhino file here, find our view. Again, if you've lost your view, you can just use the name view to locate it again. We'll go to render, make sure we're on Rhino render, and set up a basic sunlight. So we'll just make sure in lighting tabs in the render properties that sun is turned on and it's set to a good angle, and I think that should be fine for this particular option. Okay, you can always do a render preview to just see what that looks like beforehand. And I think for this that should be fine. And then when you're happy, you can just go render and render it out. And there we have a kind of simple shadow study which we can use in tandem with our 2D drawing. So let's just save that out. Site plan, and we'll save it as shadows. And what I'm going to do is as we did before, we're going to tint this in Photoshop. So I'm just going to save out my Illustrator file. And you don't have to always export it to bring it into Photoshop. We can actually just save it, and we'll just save it as, let's make sure we save it as an Illustrator file and not a PDF there. So Site 3D. And then I'm going to open up Photoshop. And with Photoshop open, we can just drag our Site 3D Illustrator file into our Photoshop tab. And we'll get this box come up here. What we can then do is we can crop to the media box, which will make sure it will be constrained to the box we set up in Illustrator, and hit OK. And you'll see there, it will come in and be quite hard to see because it won't have a background color, because Illustrator wouldn't have filled on in. So we can always just make a new layer, get a white brush, and just fill behind the lines so we can see it a bit more clearly. There we go. So now that's there, we can then locate our shadow study, which is just here, and I'm just going to drag and drop that in and drop it on. Now it almost lines up. It won't ever probably exactly line up, just because of the way the Make 2D might not be done exactly to the frame. So much like we did when we were doing the shadow study in plan, find a key point that the both objects share. I'm going to use this corner here. If you line up the corner, so make sure that's on, and then on transform, use the little crosshair in the center of the transform tool. If you can't see that, you can turn it on up here just using this tick box. And we can click and drag, and we drop it on that corner we've lined up, like so. With that there, if you hold down the Alt key, you can just scale up the image until the rest of the objects line up. And sometimes you have to kind of do it and then make sure and see. So it's still a bit off. Let's try that again. So snap the corner on. Let's just look at it up here. It's usually best to look at the furthest point. Make sure you're holding down the Alt key. And that's pretty much there, I think. I think that should do it. Yeah. Great, so that's lined that up. And what we can do now is we can adjust our shadow layer. And I'm going to color it again, so just using that hue saturation tool, holding down the Alt key to clip the hue saturation to the shadows, like so. And then we can click on colorize to change the colour of this, and I quite like my shadows as a sort of shade of blue. If you up the lightness, then the actual shadow itself will change as well, and you can up the saturation. And once you've got it to a good colour, you can then reduce the fill so it's slightly paler. So there we've got our shadow overlay. And when you're happy with that, what we can do is if we just hide the top layer, the lines, we save it out, so resave it as a JPEG, and just drop it in my folder with the shadows blue. Because we've now lined that up with our Illustrator file, all we need to do is go back to Illustrator, make a new layer for the shadows, and it will automatically line up with the artboard we've already made because we've lined it up in Photoshop. So we just drag and drop it into Illustrator. It might not drop in an exact place, but if you then make sure it snaps onto the artboard and lines up correctly, make sure it's sort of joining, then that should line up. There we go. Great. So we've got our shadow layer in, and we've got our kind of base Illustrator line work, and now all we need to do is just sort of build up the image depending on what kind of diagrams or what sort of things we want to say. Now it might be like we did before that you want to create multiple versions of this, so we have different diagrams talking about different elements of the site. So to do that again, go Document Setup, Edit Artboard, and with all the layers unlocked, if you hold down the Alt key, we can just click and drag this across and make multiple copies of our site, and let's do 3 copies for now. Then what we can do is we can make a live paint layer below this. So I'm going to make my live paint layer actually below my shadows, or should we do it on top? Let's do it below my shadows for now, and it might be that you want to make this shadow layer slightly opaque. Let's do it 50% so it's quite pale for the time being. That way we can kind of overlay it on top of our image. You can go back and change this later, so it's just sort of what looks best at each time. But as we did in the plan version, what we can then do is if we lock up the shadow layer and the site layer, this one, but unlock the other 3 layers, which are the lines. Then if we take those lines, the line work, copy these, Control C, and then paste them all in place on this layer 6 at the bottom. So Object, Edit, paste in place, and then remove the line weight. So just by going down here where it says stroke and clicking on none, we'll remove the line weight, and then under the shape builder tool, we click on the live paint bucket tool, and we can make these into a live paint group. What I'm going to do before I do that is just give them an outline so it's bounded by this as well. That way we'll be able to fill in all the shapes. So make a live paint. And what we can then do is we can start filling in depending on bits of the site we want to talk about. So let's say we want to talk about road networks again. I can make an orange here for my road, and we can start to sort of fill in areas of road that pass through the site. Maybe this diagram will be talking about the kind of road networks next to the site and how the site links up with the roads in the area, or the previous transport links, let's say. So very quickly you can just go around and start to fill those in. A couple here as well. So that might be that one. We could then maybe also on this diagram we've got pedestrian routes as well. So we could start to fill these in a different colour. And you can just use this method to just split up different elements of the site so we can quickly talk about these key areas. And it's very straightforward. Once you've got all this line work done, It's just a case of going around and picking a colour and splitting it up in that way. It might be that you want to talk about kind of traffic flows as well. So we could also make another layer on top, which could be for our for any arrows or things you want to highlight using more diagrammatic methods. So let's make a kind of darker orange arrow here, and maybe it's to do with the kind of main traffic flows on the site. I mean, there's kind of lots of different reasons you could do different things. It's sort of dependent on the project really and what you want to show with each of these diagrams. And we can change this to a dash line again. Remember, when you make new dash lines, not to match a previous dash so it doesn't get confused. We can add an arrowhead to this as well, and this has gone on that end. So if you want to flip this round, if you go to stroke and click on this little button here, it swaps the start of the arrowhead, so we can have it going different ways. We could then draw one going this way as well. And you'll probably have to add the arrowhead again if you've drawn that on. Excellent. Remember, anything that kind of slightly goes off the edge won't be seen, so don't worry too much about that. We could do another diagram talking about green space or extra buildings on the space, and once you've done one of these live paint groups, it's just a matter of unlocking that layer, and we'll call this live paint so you can see it. And we can just copy and paste it from artboard to artboard. So this multiple artboard setup we've got is a really useful way of having kind of multiple different versions of the same diagram in different instances. So we can copy it from this artboard, select our new one, and if we go edit and paste in place, it will just drop on the back of this one. And we can reset the colour just by on this fill where it says question mark. We can go none to reset it, and then select our live paint bucket again. And let's say we're talking about green space this time. We can select a nice green. Let's go with something like this. And I'm not sure exactly where the green spaces on these sites are, but let's say, for instance, these might be green spaces we're talking about, and we can start to highlight those too. So you can see very quickly we can start to build up these diagrams and add in extra pieces of information in a speedy manner, but also in a consistent manner that everything matches up and all the views are the same. So it's very clear what we're trying to say with each of these diagrams. Now, I hope that's helped you set up your own diagrams, and please go back and watch the videos on setting up the sections or plans if you want to look at other ways of doing this technique. And we'll be going into more detail into plan drawing and 3D drawings in Rhino in other videos, so please be sure to check those out too. Many thanks, and see you in the next video.